are there any downsides to using digitally recallable hardware? There are a few, to be honest. Um, the main downside I find with being limited to just using digitally recallable hardware is that there's far less options. For instance, a prime example is an EQ. If you want to buy a digitally recallable EQ, you've got the West Audio Tube EQ, or you've got the Better Maker Mastering EQ. Some would say the Carnaby HE2, but that's more of a saturation, free band saturation. You can call it an EQ if you want to. Unless I'm missing one, let me know in the comments. But I don't know. They're your options. So that's one thing. It's also you've got all the 500 series digitally recallable EQs as well. Personally, I'm more just thinking in mastering sense, but you've got options there as well. So you've got options with EQs, compressors, saturation. You've got all these different options, but there's far less. There's far less options than non-digitally recallable gear, and that will change over time because let's face it, digitally recallable hardware is the future. It's where every brand's going to end up going. And I've spoken to a lot of brands, and they want to do it, and they will do it. It's just finding a way to do it. That's one problem at the moment. That won't necessarily be a problem going forward. It'll probably go kind of the other way around, where you'll have far less non-digitally recallable gear to choose from, maybe in 20, 30 years time, when it's very much the norm. And it's like, oh, why would you make a piece of hardware without digital recall? The other thing, and this is quite an obvious one, is the software. Software has to keep continuously being updated. Now that does somewhat become a problem, because some brands, you know, you don't know how long they're going to be about. That's one thing you got to bear in mind. Now, one thing I always say you should kind of look at when you look at digitally recallable hardware is, let's hypothetically say that the hardware, the software doesn't exist. It no longer exists, and you can't use it with software anymore. Let's hypothetically say that the West Audio stuff will work without a plugin. It will. You'll be able to function in exactly the same way. I think on the newer versions, you can save to the hardware as well, which is really good. So you can save a preset that can be loaded on the hardware. So it's its own piece of gear that has a complementary piece of software. Same with something like the HE2. That's very much the same thing. Everything's accessible from the front, so you don't rely on the software. The software is very much just for automation and recall. So it still could, if you didn't want to use software, you could still use it. The problem you have with some products, the software, it's so much reliant on the software. A prime example of this is the McDSPs. Now, the McDSPs will not work if they don't have software. They need the software in order to work. There's not a single parameter to turn on the actual hardware, so you have to have the software. The one good thing about McDSP is they're not going anywhere. They're 15 years in, and their kind of software side of the company is massive, and if the hardware's not going anywhere. I've had this conversation with Colin multiple times, and he said, "Yeah, honestly, it's nothing to worry about. It's going to be here for a very, very, very long time." So that's one thing that is pretty concerning, and it's one of the reasons and one of the things that concerned me when I was building this studio. I kind of said, well, what if the company just stops updating software? Like, where do you sit then? A prime example of this is Better Maker. They don't update their software. They're terrible for it. You know, it's they kind of leave everything to die. Like if you and then you have to buy the newer product to get all the newer software updates, and the old software has a really old GUI, and it's I'm not impressed with that. But hopefully they'll change and they'll start, doing what's right and doing what the bigger companies like West Audio are doing, where they support their software. And put it this way, right? If you're gonna buy digitally recallable hardware, don't buy Better Maker, buy West Audio, because West Audio update their software regularly. They're not going anywhere. They're going from strength to strength to strength. Better Maker, they don't really release anything to what was the last thing they released? The limiter, was it the V2 limiter? That come out quite a while ago. Zero software updates. I've got majority of their stuff, and I've had the majority of it. I've had pretty much all of it, and I ended up getting rid of a few bits because they're a bit annoying. But yeah, that's one thing that is a major thing that can and potentially could become an issue. There's a company called Sepia that do the Carno rack. Now that very much relies on software, and whilst it's a really good product, and I had a go of it and I loved it and I thought, yeah, this is really good. That's a company that if them as a company, if they flop, you're left with a brick. So I mean, it's one of those things for me where I'm kind of sitting there watching it, going, I'm not buying it right now. I'm not getting involved with it right now. But let's have a look at where they are in 2-3 years time. And in 2-3 years time, if they're kind of where I want them to be, I'll then start investing in that and I'll buy into that. But it's a gamble sometimes. I when I bought the Freak Ports, the Freak Tubes. It was a new company. It was a gamble. You didn't know how big they were going to become. Thankfully, they've been massively successful with the Freak Port, so that's been massively beneficial. But it is a little bit of a gamble at the beginning. Like you can buy a Freak Tube now with belief and trust that their software is going to continually be updated, because it is. They've got a track record of maybe 3 years of updating software and bringing out new products, which is brilliant, and that's what I want to see. But sometimes, yeah, products that are reliant on software, that's a downside, and that's going to be, some companies aren't going to be able to do this whole digital recall revolution because they're not going to be able to keep up with the plug-in side of things, and that is one of the downsides. But apart from that, there's no real downsides. I can talk about the positives. Now let me quickly just brush over some of the positives of having digitally recallable hardware. So one of them is, because it's digitally recallable, most, if not all, pieces of digitally recallable hardware have dual mono. You can switch them from dual mono to mid-side to stereo. That's pretty standard with all digitally recallable gear. You can save kind of presets into the hardware that you can't do with non-digitally recallable gear. What else? Continuous updates, like for instance the West Audio rear, right? This one over here, this compressor. Now this came out. It's a tube Varimu compressor. Brilliant, sounds great. We loved it. Then they were like, yeah, well, here's saturation mode. Just do an update, and it updates all the firmware. Now you have saturation mode, which is a totally different mode, brings more life to that. Things like the McDSP, I can come in one morning and be like, oh wow, there's a channel strip, or there's a new EQ, or there's a new compressor for it. It's the gift that keeps on giving, and that's one thing with digital recall gear, is they can be updated, and new things be like GUIs be updated, features. For instance, here's a good example of this. West Audio released the was it the Tube EQ? So the Tube EQ released. We got hold of that. started using it. Yeah, bought one of those. Then there was a feature in the plugin that wasn't a feature on the hardware, and I spoke to the guys at West Audio, and I said, look, um, it's really important that everything that can be done on the plugin can be done on the hardware. And they was like, yes, you're right. It was basically what it was it was something as simple as a link function. It linked the input and output together. So if you went 5 dB of gain, the output come down 5 dB to match, and it was like that. um, that was the link function that was on the software. There wasn't a link function on the hardware. I mentioned it to them within, I think it was within about 4 hours. They were like, "Yeah, we've just posted an update on the website. We've added that feature." Now that I love, and the reason I love that is because what what's happening there is you can get with a piece of hardware that hasn't got digital recall or hasn't got any sort of connection to a computer. The hardware's a hardware. That's all it can ever be. If it goes to market and that's the version, and it's like, oh, we should have done this, or this is a feature request by someone, and it's like, oh man, we should have really done that. That's a brilliant idea. So be it. You can't do anything about it. That's the hardware. That it can't be changed. Now, the thing with digital recall gear is you can just go, right, well, here's an update to the software, and it updates the firmware, and you've got this new feature onto the hardware that it's a feature request kind of thing. That's massively beneficial. The obvious one of the one of the massive pros is obviously the digital recall aspect. That's huge. And by having a plugin inside your door, you're able to write automation. So if you want to increase or increase the high end of an EQ as if you were just turning it up like that, you can do that within the DAW. You can automate hardware, and that's brilliant. And you can't do that with non-digitally recallable gear. But look, there's lots of benefits. I guess one of the negatives to digitally recallable gear is because it has so many extra components, I guess, and also it has a lot more goes into the build, I would imagine. There's a lot more features. It can justify a higher price tag. So like these West Audio modules are at the higher end at like £1,200 per module. They're at the higher end, whereas other like Alicia X filter EQs are more around the £700 mark for a stereo EQ, but these have so much more. So there's pros and cons here. But I personally feel the pros well outweigh the cons when it comes to digitally recallable hardware.